It began with a sign on a wall, a few simple words printed in black over white, meant to reassure men who sent others to die. But on that cold morning of January 6, 1944, General James "Jimmy" Doolittle stared at that sign and saw something else, a symbol of everything that was going wrong in the skies over Europe. He turned to his colleague and said quietly, "That sign needs to come down." The sign read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back." Within hours, it was replaced with a new one. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." That single change, 14 words, rewritten by a man who refused to follow doctrine, would mark the moment when the air war over Europe changed forever. What seemed reckless to some, suicidal to others, would soon destroy the Luftwaffe in mere months. At the start of 1944, the American air campaign was bleeding out. Every week, hundreds of bombers left English airfields at dawn, and dozens never returned. The airfields would grow quiet by afternoon, except for the sound of trucks collecting the twisted wreckage of what had once been flying fortresses. Mothers and wives back home would receive telegrams marked "missing in action." Commanders called it strategy. The men who flew called it slaughter. The breaking point had come 3 months earlier, over a German city named Schweinfurt. 291 B-17 seconds were sent to cripple the ball-bearing factories that kept Hitler's war machine turning. They reached the target, dropped their payloads, and turned for home, but 60 never made it back. Another 17 landed so badly damaged they would never fly again. In a single day, 600 American airmen were dead or missing. The statistics were unbearable. In late 1943, a bomber crew's odds of surviving a full 25 mission tour were barely 1 in 3. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, one of the few crews to finish, wrote in his diary, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell." That was the cruel truth. The bombers flew too far for their escorts to protect them. American P-38 seconds and P-47 Thunderbolts, magnificent machines in their own right, simply lacked the range to follow the bombers deep into Germany. The moment they turned back, the Luftwaffe would appear hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving from the sun, cannons roaring, rockets streaking through the bomber formations. Head-on attacks at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour gave American gunners just seconds to react. One perfect hit from a 30mm cannon could tear a flying fortress in half. The sky became a graveyard. By December, General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was at his limit. His ultimatum to his commanders was blunt: destroy the German Air Force, or the bombing campaign ends. And if the bombing campaign ended, so would Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. But salvation was already sitting in a hangar in England, a sleek silver fighter with lines like poetry and a heart that roared like thunder. The North American P-51 Mustang, powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could cruise at over 430 miles per hour and reach altitudes beyond 40,000 feet. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, the Americans had a fighter that could go the distance and fight when it got there. Captain Chuck Yeager, then a young pilot in the 357th Fighter Group, would later write that the P-51 changed everything. It was faster, climbed better, and turned tighter than anything the Germans had. For the first time, we could follow the bombers to the target and still fight. But new airplanes alone wouldn't win the war. The question was how to use them. For years, American doctrine had insisted that fighters fly tight around bomber formations, shields of aluminum and speed, guarding the heavy fortresses. The job of a fighter pilot was to protect, not to hunt. Jimmy Doolittle disagreed. He wasn't a bomberman, he was a racer, a test pilot, a scientist with a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He had made his name by doing the impossible, launching medium bombers from a carrier to strike Tokyo in 1942. He understood something that charts and doctrines could not explain. In the air, the side that seizes the initiative wins. So on that January morning in England, when he told Major General William Kepner that the sign was wrong, it wasn't about words, it was about how America would fight the war. Doolittle ordered that, from now on, fighters were not to stay close to the bombers. They would go ahead 50 miles forward, 25 to either side, and hunt the Luftwaffe before it ever reached the bomber stream. It was a revolution disguised as a policy memo. To the bomber crews, it sounded like madness. To the fighter pilots, it was liberation. Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group said it best, "We're not shepherds anymore, we're wolves." In that one moment, the 8th Air Force stopped playing defense and started to fight like predators. No one could yet know that within weeks, the skies over Germany would belong to them. The decision made in a quiet English office, with a simple change of words on a wall, would destroy an entire air force and decide the fate of a continent. By the end of 1943, the 8th Air Force was running out of men faster than it could replace them. Crews that had started together in training were vanishing one by one, their names crossed out on barracks boards, their empty bunks left untouched for days. Every returning formation meant a count of ghosts. Those who survived learned not to ask who was gone. The silence after a mission told them enough. The Germans called them the Flying Fortresses, and in a way, the name was cruelly accurate. The B-17 seconds could take punishment, their aluminum skins shredded, their wings full of holes, their engines coughing fire. Many limped home missing tails, landing with blood frozen into the gun ports. But even fortresses fall when the enemy never stops coming. The tactics of the Luftwaffe were as coldly efficient as clockwork. German pilots assembled just beyond the range of American escorts, waiting for the moment when the P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds turned back for England. Then, like hawks released from a line, they dove through the bomber streams head-on. The closing speed was over 600 miles an hour, so fast that gunners had 2, maybe 3 seconds to fire before the enemy flashed past. One hit from a 30mm cannon could vaporize a crew. There were stories that circulated like whispered prayers of fortresses flying home with half their crew dead, of waste gunners frozen stiff at their posts, of co-pilots landing aircraft with their hands slick with someone else's blood. The bombers could defend themselves, yes, but it was a losing arithmetic. Too many attackers, too much sky, and no one coming to save them. General Arnold's patience broke after Schweinfurt. He knew what his subordinates refused to admit, that the daylight bombing campaign, the central pillar of Allied strategy, was unsustainable without fighter dominance. In December 1943, he gave his ultimatum: destroy the Luftwaffe, or Overlord cannot happen. The invasion of Europe depended not on armies, but on who owned the sky. And then came the machine that would change everything. When the first P-51 Mustangs arrived in England, they gleamed like silver ghosts under the winter sun. Their noses were long, their wings narrow and elegant, and the sound of their Merlin engines deep, smooth, confident, seemed almost arrogant compared to the coarse growl of the Thunderbolts. They were faster than anything the Germans had, and they could go anywhere the bombers went. For the first time, the men in the cockpits felt they had a fighting chance. Captain Chuck Yeager described the feeling years later. The Mustang climbed like a homesick angel. At high altitude, it could run circles around anything in the Luftwaffe. For the first time, we weren't out of breath up there, the Germans were. But the machine was only part of the equation. The other part was the mind, the courage to use that machine differently. Doolittle had both. He studied the numbers, the range tables, the loss charts, but he also studied the men. He listened to the quiet fury of the fighter pilots who hated being tied to bomber formations, and the despair of the bomber crews who called those same fighters their lifeline. He knew any change would mean risking lives, thousands of them. Yet he also knew that staying the course would destroy the 8th Air Force entirely, and still, in his first week of command, the old doctrine held firm. The fighters stayed close, flying tight over the bomber boxes, eyes scanning the edges of the formation, forbidden to pursue the enemy. The Germans had learned the pattern and exploited it ruthlessly. They would mass beyond sight, dive through the formation, kill and vanish before the escorts could react. It was defense masquerading as strategy, and defense was not how wars were won. Major General Ira Eaker, Doolittle's predecessor, had built that doctrine out of logic and fear. He believed the bombers could defend themselves with their heavy machine guns, and that fighters were merely an added shield. He was a bomber man, born and trained to think in formations, not duels. Doolittle came from a different world, the world of speed, risk, and single-seat decisions. He had seen the future before anyone else. Back in 1942, he'd taken off from the carrier Hornet in a B-25 and led a strike against Tokyo, a mission no one thought possible. He knew that victory demanded audacity. Now, with the fate of the air war on his shoulders, he prepared to make another leap into the unknown. The men around him were skeptical. The bomber commanders saw him as a gambler, a man willing to trade discipline for chaos. The pilots admired him but feared the orders he might give. Yet to Doolittle, the choice was simple: keep losing predictably, or take a risk and win decisively. Outside the hangars, snow gathered in drifts along the runways of East Anglia. Ground crews wrapped in oil-stained coats worked by the dim orange light of kerosene lamps, tuning the engines that would roar at dawn. The bombers sat in long rows like silent giants, their bellies full of bombs, their fuselages already marked with bullet scars from previous missions. Men smoked in silence beside them, staring at the horizon, where Germany waited like a dark promise. When Doolittle walked through those airfields, he felt the weight of what was coming. He knew the numbers, 25% survival, maybe less. But he also felt something else in the cold air: the possibility of changing that math forever. He gathered his senior officers and spoke plainly. There would be no more hiding behind formations, no more waiting for the enemy to strike first. The fighters would be freed. They would not defend the bombers, they would hunt the hunters. It was a doctrine born of desperation, but also of clarity. As the first weeks of January passed, the weather across Europe turned savage. The skies filled with snow and fog, grounding both sides. The bombers sat idle, their crews restless. In the mess halls, rumors spread that Doolittle was planning something radical, that the fighters would soon be unleashed. The older men shook their heads. The younger ones, restless for glory, smiled. Somewhere in Germany, Luftwaffe pilots were writing letters home, boasting of their latest victories. They didn't yet know that the next time they took off, they would not be the hunters. They would be the hunted. The order came quietly, without ceremony, written in the clean, clipped language of a military directive. But its meaning landed like a bomb across every airfield in England. From that day forward, American fighters were no longer to stay close to the bombers. They would fly ahead 50 miles forward, 25 miles to either side, and attack anything that moved. Doolittle's words were clear: the mission of the fighter is to destroy German fighters. To the bomber crews who read it on the bulletin boards, it felt like betrayal. Men who had watched their friends die in flaming fortresses saw the words and thought, "He's leaving us to die alone." They whispered the same sentence in mess halls and briefing tents: "Doolittle's gone mad." But in the fighter squadrons, the reaction was different. There was silence at first, a long, disbelieving quiet, and then a rising grin that spread from one pilot to the next. Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group summed it up in a single line: "We're not shepherds anymore, we're wolves." It was a revolution born from a single sheet of paper. For 2 years, fighter pilots had been told to protect, not to pursue. Their wings were leashed to the slow bomber streams. They were trained to defend, to react, to wait. Now Doolittle had cut the leash. For the first time, they could take the initiative, strike first, and make the enemy bleed before he ever reached the bombers. But in those first days, no one truly knew if the plan would work or if it would end in catastrophe. The bombermen had reason to fear. They'd survived attacks only because their escorts had stayed close, chasing off the Germans before the kill shots could come. Now those same escorts would disappear over the horizon, leaving the formations alone in a sky that was already painted with death. It sounded like madness because, on paper, it was. Doolittle understood the risk better than anyone, but he also understood the mathematics of war. Every time a German fighter died, it wasn't just a machine lost, it was a pilot gone, a veteran with years of experience that Germany could never replace. Every Mustang or Thunderbolt that hunted ahead and killed one of those men was buying time for hundreds of bombers behind them. Across the channel, the Luftwaffe was entering its own kind of crisis. On paper, their numbers were strong factories still turning out over 1,000 fighters a month, but those aircraft were being handed to boys who had barely learned to fly. The training hours had been cut in half, then halved again. They were taught to take off, climb, and shoot. The rest they were expected to learn in combat if they survived long enough. Veteran German pilots wrote home about the chaos. Feldwebel Hans Dammers described it in a letter to his brother. The new boys last 3, maybe 4 missions. They don't know how to fly in formation. They freeze when attacked. We try to protect them, but we can't protect everyone. We are dying faster than they can replace us. Even so, in the bitter winter of 1944, the Luftwaffe still believed victory was within reach. Major General Adolf Galland, their fighter commander, reported confidently to Hermann Göring that American losses were unsustainable. "Keep the pressure," he wrote. "By spring, they will have to stop." But Galland had made a fatal mistake. He was counting airplanes, not pilots. While Germany's factories could still build aircraft, its training schools could not build men. The Americans were training pilots with over 450 hours of flight time, much of it in combat aircraft. The Germans were sending boys into the air with barely 150 hours, sometimes less than 100. The Luftwaffe was still strong on paper, but in the air, it was hollowing out. And Doolittle was about to break what remained. The first test came at the end of January. The weather finally cleared after weeks of storms. On January 29th, more than 800 American bombers took off from bases across England, heading for Frankfurt. The sky filled with their droning engines, and above them, the silver shapes of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts stretched ahead farther than they ever had before. At 28,000 feet, the air was thin and glittering. Sunlight flashed off the wings like fire. Somewhere ahead, German fighters were climbing to intercept. They expected to meet bombers. They were wrong. Near Bonn, a group of 50 Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds rose in perfect formation, their pilots tightening their gloves, preparing for another day's work. They never saw the Mustangs coming. From above, out of the high sun, the Americans dove 4 squadrons descending at once, throttles wide open, guns armed. The first burst tore through the German formation before anyone had time to break. The sky erupted in silver fragments, smoke, and falling wings. In 8 minutes, it was over. 13 German fighters gone, 2 Mustangs damaged but still flying. The rest of the German formation fled. The bombers, miles behind, flew on through clear skies. Later that day, Colonel Blakesley and his men caught another group of Focke-Wulfs forming up over Cologne. The Germans were still heavy with fuel, slow and climbing. The Americans came from above, faster, lighter, already in position. Blakesley's report afterward was simple. It was a slaughter. We destroyed 11 before they could turn. This is how you win a war. For the bomber crews high above Frankfurt, it was the first quiet run in months. No black swarm of interceptors, no flashing cannon fire cutting through the clouds, just the rhythmic rumble of engines and the cold, empty sky. Somewhere below, the hunters had done their work. By nightfall, everyone on the ground knew something had changed. The fighter groups were jubilant, the bomber crews were cautious, but hopeful. And Doolittle, sitting alone in his quarters, reading the day's reports, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The risk had worked. But this was only the beginning. In the weeks ahead, his order would grow into something far larger, a systematic campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. The bombers would serve as bait, the fighters as executioners. Every sortie would draw the Germans out to fight, and every fight would thin their ranks further. The madness was beginning to make sense. The winter storms broke at last, and when they did, the sky over England came alive. Engines roared before dawn, the ground trembling under the weight of hundreds of bombers lined in endless rows, their wings silvered by frost and moonlight. Crews moved through the fog like ghosts, fastening flight gear, checking gun belts, whispering short prayers. This was the beginning of Operation Argument, soon to be called simply Big Week, and everyone knew it would decide the future of the air war. On February 20th, 1944, the order went out. The largest air armada in history would strike Germany's heart: Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt, Leipzig, Augsburg, the factories that built the Luftwaffe itself. The Americans knew the Germans couldn't afford to ignore such attacks. They would have to rise, to fight, to defend. And this time, the hunters were waiting. More than 1,000 bombers took off from England and Italy that morning, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. The mission wasn't just to hit factories, it was to draw out every German fighter in the Reich and destroy them. For the first time, the bombers were the bait. From the cockpit of his Messerschmitt 109, German ace Erich Hartmann looked up and saw the sky thick with contrails, endless silver lines stretching to the horizon. He had never seen so many aircraft at once. "This is not a bombing raid," he said into his radio. "This is a trap. They want us to come up and fight." And they did. Over 900 German fighters scrambled that day, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs rising from dozens of airfields. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything it had into the air. From sea level to 40,000 feet, the sky filled with the contrails of thousands of aircraft. The noise was beyond description: engines, flak, machine guns, radios crackling with panic and rage. But this time, the Americans didn't stay with the bombers. They were everywhere, scattered across hundreds of miles, diving on German formations before they could even reach the targets. Captain Urban Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group saw the impossible that day. A squadron of German Me-262 jets, their swept wings glinting below him as they took off near Leipzig. The jets were deadly once airborne, faster than anything in the world, but vulnerable on takeoff. Drew pushed his throttle forward, dove through the flak, and opened fire. His bullets ripped into the lead jet, which exploded in a blinding orange bloom. The second jet tried to lift off and was hit before it could climb. Drew pulled up through smoke and debris, his cockpit rattling. He wrote later in his report, "The jets are dangerous in the air, but they must take off and land like any other aircraft. Catch them there, and they burn like any other." The effect of Doolittle's strategy was immediate. On that first day of Big Week, the Americans lost 21 bombers and 4 fighters, numbers that would once have been catastrophic, but now seemed almost miraculous. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost 50 fighters destroyed and 38 pilots killed or wounded. And the killing didn't stop. For 5 straight days, whenever weather permitted, the raids continued. Factories in every corner of Germany were hit. Brunswick, Regensburg, Gotha, Schweinfurt again. Every target forced the Luftwaffe into the air, and every flight cost them more men. By February 23rd, the German squadrons were exhausted. Pilots flew 4, sometimes 5 missions a day. Mechanics worked until they collapsed beside the runways. The new recruits arriving from training schools were barely competent to fly, let alone survive combat. Major Heinz Baer, an ace with over 200 victories, wrote in his diary, "We shoot down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. We form up, and they attack. We land, and they strafe the field. We take off, and they are waiting. There is no escape. For every bomber we destroy, we lose 2 fighters and the men who fly them." On the morning of February 25th, the final day of Big Week, German radar screens lit up once again. The Americans were coming, hundreds of bombers and fighters stretching across the North Sea. But this time, the Luftwaffe's response was scattered. Entire groups failed to launch because their fields had been cratered by strafing runs. Others launched late, flying into ambushes set by Mustangs prowling low and fast. By nightfall, it was over. The numbers told the story with brutal precision. American losses: 226 bombers, 28 fighters, about 2,600 men. German losses: more than 350 fighters destroyed, 90 more crippled, and nearly 100 of their best pilots gone forever. Those were just numbers on a page, but each one told a human story: the young German ace who didn't come back, the mechanic burned alive on the tarmac, the American tail gunner who looked out and saw no enemy at all for the first time. For Doolittle, reading the reports that night, the meaning was clear. The Luftwaffe was breaking not in factories, not in strategy rooms, but in the air itself. His gamble had paid off. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. Every pilot he lost, every plane that failed to return, weighed on him. He had freed his fighters to kill but also to die. There was no way to win this war cleanly. Air supremacy, he understood, was not achieved through technology or bravery alone. It was bought with blood. Still, he believed it was worth the cost. In the weeks that followed, American fighters carried the war deeper into Germany. They no longer merely escorted, they hunted. Returning from missions, they dove low over the countryside, strafing airfields, trains, fuel depots, anything that moved. They struck the Luftwaffe not just in the sky but on the ground, turning every airfield into a battlefield. German pilots began to write in their letters what no one dared say aloud: "Nowhere is safe." The airfields that once represented security had become death traps. Aircraft parked in the open were shredded by gunfire. Mechanics were killed repairing engines. Fuel trucks exploded like torches. The Luftwaffe was dying not in battle but in maintenance bays, on taxiways, in hangars. In a single month, everything changed. The bombers that had once flown into Germany alone now roared across the continent under clear skies. The gunners looked out their windows and saw no enemy. The silence of the air, once unthinkable, was the sound of Doolittle's victory taking shape. By March 1944, the sky over Europe had changed color. Once it had belonged to the Germans, cold, lethal, filled with the black smoke of burning fortresses. Now it was pale and empty, disturbed only by the steady drone of American engines moving unopposed toward Berlin. The hunters had become ghosts, and the ghosts now ruled the sky. Doolittle's gamble had turned into a doctrine. Every week the fighter sweeps grew bolder. Mustangs dove low over railway yards, their wings flashing in the morning light as they strafed trains packed with ammunition. Thunderbolts screamed across airfields, chewing through hangars and fuel depots until the ground burned like an open furnace. The Luftwaffe began to run not in defeat, but in exhaustion. At first, the German command tried to mask the losses. They counted planes built instead of pilots lost. Factories still produced hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, but each one rolled out of assembly halls only to be flown by a boy with trembling hands. Training hours had collapsed to barely 100. Some pilots were sent into combat with less than 20 hours in the aircraft they were supposed to fight in. In the ready rooms of the Reich, the veterans tried to hide their despair. They sat beside young replacements who called them Sir but couldn't hold formation through turbulence. Major Hans Dammers, one of the few with more than 50 kills, wrote home to his mother, "They come to us fresh-faced, full of pride. They don't understand that they're already dead. We fly into the sky together, and when I look back, half are gone." The Americans didn't know those names, but they could feel the change. The missions that once meant suicide now felt different. Bombers reached their targets. Fighters returned with their ammunition half spent and stories of empty skies. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who flew P-47 Thunderbolts, later said, "By February, we stopped waiting to be attacked. We went looking for them. By May, we couldn't find enough to fight." Then came the great test, the attack on Berlin. On March 6, 1944, more than 700 bombers lifted off from England, escorted by nearly 800 fighters. For the first time, the target was the German capital itself. The city's defenses braced for the onslaught, confident that no enemy could cross so deep into their airspace and live. But as the first formations approached, something was wrong. The radar stations reported scattered contacts, then silence. The German fighters that did manage to scramble found themselves ambushed on their own climb. Over 150 German aircraft made it into the air that day. Almost none returned. The battle stretched across hundreds of miles. Smoke from burning airfields drifted across the countryside like low fog. Civilians on the outskirts of Berlin watched dogfights unravel above them, tiny glints twisting and vanishing in the sunlight, then falling as black trails of smoke. By nightfall, the reports were catastrophic. 69 American bombers and 11 fighters were lost, painful but replaceable. The Germans had lost 160 fighters destroyed and another 50 crippled beyond repair. Worse, 70 of their most experienced pilots were dead or wounded. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, the truth could no longer be denied. The Air Force that had once ruled Europe was dying not from numbers, but from starvation of experience, of training, of hope. The veterans were gone. The boys sent to replace them never stood a chance. Captain Johannes Wiese, one of the last surviving group commanders, wrote that night, "Today I watched the fighter arm die. We threw everything at them, and it was not enough. Their losses are temporary. Ours are permanent." The statistics that followed were merciless. Between January and May 1944, Germany lost over 1,000 fighter pilots, 1/4 of its total force. 28 aces with more than 30 victories each were gone. 8 aces with over 100 kills were killed or captured. Every death tore a hole in the fragile structure of the Luftwaffe. The young recruits who replaced them flew bravely but blindly. American production made the contrast obscene. In 6 months, U.S. factories turned out over 22,000 fighters. Germany built fewer than 10,000 and had no men to fly them. The training schools that once produced elite pilots now ran in chaos. Some trainees learned combat maneuvers using gliders because there wasn't enough fuel for real aircraft. Others never learned to land before being rushed to the front. The psychological tide turned as well. German pilots who once hunted with arrogance now took off knowing the odds. Their confidence had become ritual, strapping on their flight gear, muttering old slogans, hoping for mercy. The best of them died trying to protect the rest. By April, the transformation was complete. The veteran squadrons that had shredded bomber formations in 1943 no longer existed. What remained of the Luftwaffe was a scattered force of exhausted men and undertrained boys. On May 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched 900 bombers to strike oil refineries and rail yards deep inside Germany. Over 750 fighters escorted them. Not a single German fighter rose to intercept. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe did not come. In Berlin, Adolf Galland, once confident, now wrote the message he had dreaded. "The fighter force is destroyed. We have aircraft but no fuel. We have pilots, but most cannot fight. The Americans attack at will. We can no longer contest the air. And across the channel, Doolittle's men watched the dawn from their cockpits, knowing the sky was theirs. The enemy that had once seemed invincible was gone, broken by a strategy born from what everyone had called madness. When the Allied invasion fleet gathered along the English coast that June, its soldiers looked up and saw a sky filled only with friendly aircraft. On June 6, 1944, D-Day began under a blue canopy untouched by German wings. 14,000 Allied sorties thundered overhead. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 300. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, watching from France, sent one last message to his wife. The enemy has complete air superiority. Our troops cannot move in daylight. Without air cover, we cannot hold the beaches. And so the victory that began with a single order written in an English office reached its full expression on the beaches of Normandy. What had started as a reckless idea had become one of the most decisive campaigns in military history. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed not by bombers, not by factories burning, but by Doolittle's conviction that the best defense was a relentless offense. By summer, the skies were silent, except for the steady, confident hum of Allied aircraft heading east. The hunters had done their work. The wolves had cleared the air. By the time the sun rose over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the war in the air was already over. German soldiers on the beaches lifted their heads and saw only the silver bellies of Allied bombers. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had vanished into silence. On that day alone, Allied aircraft flew over 14,000 sorties. The Germans managed fewer than 300. The sky no longer belonged to them, it belonged to Doolittle's gamble. From October 1943 to June 1944, the transformation was absolute. In half a year, the Luftwaffe had gone from hunter to hunted, from a force that ruled the air to one that barely existed. 6 months earlier, they had been unstoppable. Now they were shadows, planes without pilots, bases without fuel, officers writing reports no one believed. Doolittle's order had rewritten the nature of the air war. What began as a rebellion against Doctrine had become a principle. Fighters win wars not by defending, but by attacking. It was a simple truth, yet one that every commander before him had been too afraid to test. For the men who flew under his command, the cost was written in absence. Over 10,000 American airmen died in the skies over Europe in the first half of 1944. Many of them never saw the results of what they had achieved. Their names were carved into mess hall walls, into notebooks, into memory. The survivors would tell their stories for decades about missions over Berlin, about dogfights that lasted seconds, about the sound of a Mustang engine throttling open like the roar of justice. Lieutenant Robert Johnson would later write, "We talk about tactics and numbers, but what really happened was that thousands of young men climbed into aircraft every day, knowing many would not come back. We won because we kept flying anyway." By August, the Luftwaffe as a coherent fighting force no longer existed. Germany still built planes, tens of thousands of them. New jets, sleek and deadly, rolled off the production lines. But there were no veterans left to fly them. The men who could have trained the next generation were gone, shot down between January and May. Those who survived were exhausted, flying missions they no longer believed in. Major Erich Rudorfer, one of the few surviving aces, said years later, "We had planes, even jets, but no fuel, no time, and no men who knew what they were doing. The Americans had killed all the good pilots in the spring. The war was already lost." In post-war Germany, Adolf Galland, the same man who once declared that America's losses were unsustainable, would write in his memoir, "When the Americans changed their fighter tactics in January 1944, they won the air war. We could fight the bombers. We could not fight the bombers and their fighters at once. Once their fighters were free to hunt, we were doomed. That freedom, Doolittle's simple, audacious decision to change a sentence on a wall, had altered everything. By the end of 1944, the statistics were beyond comprehension. Over 4,000 German fighter pilots killed, 11,000 aircraft destroyed in combat or on the ground. Training hours for new German pilots had fallen from 200 to less than 100. The average American pilot now entered combat with 4 times as much flight experience as his enemy. The kill ratios told the same story. In 1943, the Luftwaffe had averaged 1.2 kills for every loss. By late 1944, the Americans were destroying nearly 4 German aircraft for every one they lost. By 1945, that number rose to 7 to 1. But numbers never tell the whole truth. The real change was psychological. In 1943, American bomber crews flew in fear, whispering prayers and hoping the fighters would stay close. By the spring of 1944, that fear had turned to confidence. They would look out their windows and see Mustangs darting across the sky, no longer tethered to the formation, but streaking ahead like silver wolves. When the Germans failed to appear, the crews knew Doolittle's men had found them first. Even the bomber commanders who had once cursed him came to understand. Major General Frederick Anderson, who had opposed the order, admitted later, "I believed keeping the fighters close was the only way to protect the bombers. I was wrong. Killing enemy fighters before they attack is far more effective than protecting during the attack." Doolittle understood this. I did not. The doctrine that emerged from that winter would shape every air war that followed the Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. It became the foundation of modern air supremacy. Control of the sky does not come from defense, but from destruction. Decades later, in a quiet hall of the National Museum of the United States Air Force, 2 signs hang side by side. One reads, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." And, next to it, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." Visitors walk past them every day, unaware that between those 2 sentences lies the hinge of history. In the 1972nd, long retired and white-haired, James Doolittle spoke about that January morning. His voice was calm, but his eyes still carried the spark of the man who had led a raid on Tokyo and rewritten the rules of war. "Changing the tactics was the hardest decision I made," he said. "People thought it was madness. Some called it murder. But I knew we couldn't win by defending. We had to attack. It cost us terribly, but the cost of not doing it would have been worse." He paused, then smiled faintly. "We won because we attacked." In those few words lay the entire philosophy of modern air combat, a belief that offense, though costly, is the only path to victory. When Doolittle died in 1993, his ashes were buried with full military honors. The roar of fighter jets echoed overhead, tracing white arcs in the blue sky. It was fitting. He had taught the world that the sky itself could be conquered not with numbers, not with slogans, but with courage, risk, and the willingness to think differently. The Luftwaffe had not been destroyed by bombs, but by an idea that began with a man standing in front of a wall, reading a sign and whispering, "That's wrong." And because of that one moment, the bombers came home.